Hi, I'm Andrea Douglas, and I am the Executive Director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. I'd like to welcome you to At the Heritage Center. I'm here today with Zun Lee, photographer, and we're going to be talking about his exhibition that is on view June 5th through August 29th, entitled Father Figure, Exploring Alternative Notions of Black Fatherhood. Zun, thanks so much for being with us. I'm so happy you're here.
Really glad to be here. And it's a pleasure.
So, tell me a little bit about the title. Why father figure?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of keep it very generic. I didn't want to go into specifics around what a father is or father figure, and I wanted to purposefully keep it very general and generic, because I wanted people to come up with their own conclusions after seeing the work. How they feel about this notion of fatherhood, and particularly the notion of African American fatherhood, which is very much a hot topic in the media. And I wanted them to sort of get away from what is presented in the media and come to their own conclusions around what the notion of fatherhood means for the community and for Black men in particular.
Okay. So tell me, how does this body of work figure in the kind of work that you do? Is this typical of the work that you do, or?
It's typical and maybe not so typical. I didn't set out to really make this a project. It sort of was an idea that started in 2011 at a workshop. And at that time I was actually pretty much doing, I would say, street photography, based on a need to be out on the street and photograph strangers, because I had a sense of wanting to connect to people and their stories. And for me, this project began as an extension of doing that. And what I wanted to explore is actually my own personal story, because I have my own sort of narrative around it's experiencing Black father absence. And I wanted to personally deal with those emotions that I had around this topic, but also you know, the reason I felt so much resentment about my own history was, you know, all the negative stereotypes that are out in the media. And for me, it was sort of, rather than just looking at what's being spoon-fed to me, I was really going to look behind the scenes and explore, how do we even get here?
Right.
What led to all these images being out there, and also what led to these images being so persistent? Because we now know, research has shown many years, and just recently even, that African American fathers are no better or worse than fathers of any other race or ethnicity, but the persisting notion is that the face of father absence is still African American.
Right. So I'm going to take a step out for a minute, and then let's talk about your journey, because you did mention for a moment a notion of a journey. When did you first start taking pictures?
I didn't really take photography seriously until maybe 2009.
Really?
So I've only been doing this for about 5-6 years. And again, not really with the intention of becoming a professional. I started as a hobby. And then it really became serious 4 years ago when I started this project. And what caused you to make pictures? What was the initial driving force as the hobby? A lot of stress at work. I was in a very stressful job, a corporate job that required a lot of travel. I was rarely home. And some of the coworkers said, look, you need something on the road to do on the road. And so they gave me a camera. And I kind of was a reluctant photographer. I kind of really wasn't into the technical aspects of it. I was kind of taking pictures of everything: birds, flowers, bees, buildings. And it wasn't until I started taking pictures of strangers in the street that I really became interested in photography as a way to get at other people's stories. And it was my interest to find out what somebody's story was, and that became addictive over time. And then I think it was also neat and then to not only connect to somebody else's story, but then to connect to parts of my story that I didn't really have to or want to deal with at that time. And so for me, it was sort of definitely a self-therapeutic aspect to it.
Do you remember the one picture that's caused you to think, oh, okay, I can do this. This is a successful image? Oh,
wow. I do remember a moment, and not necessarily because the image was successful. I don't think particularly that the image is great, but I remember the story. It happened in mid-2010 when I was in Toronto, where I live and work. And I ran into two homeless street kids, and they beckoned to me and said, look, take a picture of us, because nobody else really wants to talk to us. And we want you to just kind of have a conversation with us. And I realized my camera was a tool to create connection. And what I remember vividly is not so much the image, but the conversation that I had with these kids and their need to be heard and their need to be seen. And my vehicle was the camera. And that became sort of a moment when I decided, you know what, I think I like that aspect of connecting to people and them sharing and making themselves vulnerable, and my camera being the facilitator or catalyst to do that.
Right, and that's an interesting turn then, because street photography generally is a distanced relationship. Absolutely. Where you're just trying to capture, but now you've gotten to a place where you're more engaged with your subject.
Right, and you know, when I was doing it, I didn't even call it street photography. That's sort of a placeholder that others imposed on what I was doing. Because the notion of street photography, as I mentioned, is you're sort of the candid observer. You stay back and let things evolve in front of you. And for me, that wasn't ever something I was interested in. I really wanted to inject myself into a situation and create an interaction. Not an interaction that's forced or that's unwelcome, but something that's a give and take. And for me, I think it's those give and take moments that create some photographic intimacy even between strangers. And you know, for me on the street, that was kind of intriguing. You know, how can I get a complete stranger to trust me even for a split second? And that became pretty addictive over time.
And so that sort of belies or calls to mind a relationship to narrative. But I'm looking at these works, and I wouldn't necessarily say that there is a consistent narrative.
Right.
They may be moments in a lifetime, but where does narrative then fit for you, given the kinds of relationships that you have developed?
Sure, and you're right. In most of my photography with respect to this project, I'm really looking for the non-story. So I have established relationships with different African American fathers and families, but what I'm really looking for is these ephemeral in-between moments that are not really iconic, that are not really part of a story, but just moments of a momentary emotion, tenderness, love, affection. Something that gets lost, you know, and that's not really either newsworthy or something that we even observe, but something we really have to pay attention to in order for it to get noticed. And for me, that was important because the issue of Black father absence is so saturated with narrative that I wanted to take a step back and say, no, there's so much narrative out there, either good or bad, and I wanted to take a step back from that and really look at who are these men really, and what do they do to demonstrate their own personal notion of fatherhood outside of the media narrative, outside of the stereotypes. And so for me, that became sort of the overarching theme across all these images.
Right. Well, I'm sure people want to know, how did you make these relationships?
That's a really tough question and a tough answer because there's a lot of rejection. I think I approached about 400 families in total, and maybe out of these 40 or 50 say, yeah, maybe we'll consider it, and then out of these maybe a dozen or so actually end up working with you. So I think 9 out of 10 families kind of definitely don't really want to do this. And I'm pretty honest and upfront about my intentions. I kind of just say, look, here's what I'm doing, and I don't want to invite you to a studio. I want to go into your house and see how you live. And a lot of people are like, yeah, no. I don't think I like the idea, but there's a father over there. Why don't you go talk to them? So there's a lot of rejection, and a lot of even the relationships I had with the families that I worked with took a long time to build. Months, sometimes years, of just going and not even photographing, just spending time, getting to know them, changing diapers, doing dishes, helping out with chores, and just making sure that I earn their trust first as a person, not necessarily as a photographer. But here's a guy who, you know, is a good guy, and I'll be like having him around, and you know, now he says he wants to take pictures. Okay, and the pictures taken, they happen as a byproduct of that relationship. So but it wasn't easy and it took a long time.
Yeah.
So.
And I think then in that regard then, when you say byproduct, then that sort of feels like how you get these moments.
Right,
because it's not necessarily about, as you say, it's not about the narrative. We're not writing the story. We're forming relationships.
And that was important because a lot of families are like, so you're here with this camera, what do you want us to do? Like nothing, just do your thing. You know, obviously I'm here, so you know you're aware that I'm in your space, but treat me as if I'm not around. And you know, I really wanted them to get comfortable in showing me who they really are, and not you know, me coming to a house and you know the floor is clean, everything's put back in the closet. You know, people wearing their Sunday best. Okay, now you can take pictures. I wanted them to just show me exactly what's going on when nobody's there.
Right.
And I realized that's asking them a lot, because you know, these are not just pictures that I take for my own personal consumption or theirs. They're supposed to be seen at some point by the outside world, and that takes a specific level of trust.
Right.
That trust always had to be negotiated and renegotiated, because once consent was given didn't mean that consent was always there.
Right.
So once they realized, oh, these pictures are going to get out there, and people are going to comment, and people are going to write about it, and not always flatteringly. They want to know, you know, so why exactly are you doing this, and what exactly is this reaction going to cause for us? And these are not people that are known, or they're not necessarily expecting to be gazed upon by outsiders. So for them, it's also an experience where they have to then negotiate for themselves. Do we really want to continue this or not?
Right.
So,
how many pictures total do you think you've taken of these people?
Maybe close to 10, 12,000.
Yeah, and how do you edit then?
That's a good question. I often don't touch them for months. I just want to let them sit. And I need to gain some distance from the situation, because a lot of situations are very intense. And so for me, it's important to step back from that and let that marinate a bit, so I can evaluate the image outside of my own emotions. And there's some immediate things that I gravitate towards based on, you know, the criteria that I mentioned in terms of, is there something ephemeral, fleeting, that often gets lost? And if I find that, then I hang on to that. But there's many times where I go back to a stack of images that I thought had nothing, or even, you know, as part of the bookmaking process, you know, working with my editor and designer, it was sort of a process where they found a lot of images that I had either not looked at or thought were interesting or valuable, and they thought, no, these are definitely the images that we want. So I'd say out of 100 images, there's maybe 5 or 6 that end up being worthy of consideration.
Right, and 5 or 6 that sort of just jump out, they speak.
Kind of jump out, they speak, either because they have a narrative that's not part of the mainstream media sort of bombardment that we experience, or for the decided lack of narrative. You know, this could be any father anywhere.
Right.
And in a way, they at the same time happen to be a black family, but also this is happening because they're a black family. So that dichotomy was very important.
What interests me is most of your images are of American men.
Right.
And you don't live in America generally.
I don't, no.
So that also seems to be yet another level of distance.
Distance, but also kinship.
Yeah. Tell me about that.
I grew up in an African-American community context and household and family context since I was age 3. So for me, it was also that which I had lived with, and my own lived experience was around African-American men and families. So for me, it was important to document something that I know personally, and that's not something that I approach as an outsider. And that's a community that has always embraced me as their own, and that I had access to. And so even though I don't physically live in America, that's sort of a relationship that I've always had and maintained over the years. And for me, it was important to then even, you know, as part of processing my own story, to tap back into the relationships that I had. And so for me, it made sense to photograph African-American men and families. And then also the work itself given everything that's happening right now and has been happening over the past few years in terms of racial profiling and how Black masculinity is being portrayed, and the Black community as a whole has been portrayed in the media, there was a certain acuity to the work that kind of sharpened the focus on what it is that I wanted to photograph.
Yeah.
So.
And let's talk about that a little bit, because, you know, when what attracted me right away to these images was something along those lines. These are the things that we're thinking about right now. You know, we're 50 years celebrating Civil Rights Act, 50 years celebrating Voting Rights Acts, 50 years celebrating Immigrant Rights Acts. And clearly, being caused to think about the moment in American history of transitions, right? And living in a space of transition. And then having talked to you about the Monahan Report, right? You're mentioning that. And then coming to the recognition that, yes, in fact, we're 50 years anniversary of that report too, the March report.
Absolutely.
And what that report was a description, right? And so and I know you're aware of the Monahan Report. Was that part of what you were thinking about as well in 2011 when you started this?
Absolutely, on many different levels, because I didn't just sort of begin photographing. I did a lot of background research in terms of what's out there, and not in terms of just the media stuff, but in terms of social services programming, sociological research around African American fatherhood and dysfunctional families. And the report comes up as a red thread over and over again. You know, this is sort of the report that spawned a whole level of systemic and structural programming around how do we best support the fragile Black family. And there was always this notion after the report tied into the Black family as dysfunctional, in need of structural support, and most often that structural support being tied around the mother, because the fathers more or less were absent, and if they were present, they're more or less seen as providers, and not really part of or in the picture literally or figuratively. So the way that services were organized as a result of that report still has a sort of long-term effect in terms of how people can access services and how people feel they're supported in general, you know, depending on their family situation. So this is not just about how people perceive certain images, but it has concrete effects in terms of how people are concretely supported on the ground with social service programming, with access to how to navigate the system and other various resources. So there's a perception, and you know, some might say it's a perception versus actual reality that you know, that most services are